needed to subdue the rebellion. But Mr. Lincoln also saw the fearful responsibility he would be taking upon himself if he forced McClellan to fight against his own judgment and protest, even though that judgment was incorrect. The whole subject, therefore, underwent a new and yet more elaborate investigation. The delay which this rendered necessary was soon greatly lengthened by two other causes. It was about this time that the telegraph brought news from the West of the surrender of Fort Henry, February 6, the investment of Fort Donelson on the 13th, and its surrender on the 16th, incidents which absorbed the constant attention of the President and the Secretary of War. Almost simultaneously, a heavy domestic sorrow fell upon Mr. Lincoln in the serious illness of his son Willie, an interesting and most promising lad of 12, and his death in the White House on February 20. When February 22 came, while there was plainly no full compliance with the President's War Order No. 1, there was, nevertheless, such promise of a beginning, even at Washington, as justified reasonable expectation. The authorities looked almost hourly for the announcement of two preliminary movements which had been preparing for many days: one to attack rebel batteries on the Virginia shore of the Potomac, the other to throw bridges, one of pontoons, the second a permanent bridge of canal boats, across the river at Harper's Ferry, and an advance by Banks' division on the Winchester to protect the opening of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and reestablish transportation to and from the West over that important route. On the evening of February 27, Secretary Stanton came to the President and, after locking the door to prevent interruption, opened and read two dispatches from McClellan, who had gone personally to superintend the crossing. The first dispatch from the general described the fine spirits of the troops and the splendid throwing of the pontoon bridge by Captain Duane and his 3 lieutenants, for whom he at once recommended brevets, and the immediate crossing of the 8,500 infantry. This dispatch was dated at 10 o'clock the previous night. "The next is not so good," remarked the Secretary of War. It stated that the lift rock was too small to permit the canal boats to enter the river, so that it was impossible to construct the permanent bridge. He would therefore be obliged to fall back upon the safe and slow plan of merely covering the reconstruction of the railroad, which would be tedious and make it impossible to seize Winchester. "What does this mean?" asked the President in amazement. "It means," said the Secretary of War, "that it is a damned fizzle. It means that he doesn't intend to do anything." The President's indignation was intense, and when, a little later, General Marcy, McClellan's father-in-law and chief of staff, came in, Lincoln's criticism of the affair was in sharper language than was his usual habit. "Why, in the name of common sense," said he excitedly, "couldn't the general have known whether the canal boats would go through that lock before he spent $1 million getting them there? I am almost despairing at these results. Everything seems to fail. The impression is daily gaining ground that the general does not intend to do anything. By a failure like this, we lose all the prestige gained by the capture of Fort Donelson." The prediction of the Secretary of War proved correct. That same night, McClellan revoked Hooker's authority to cross the lower Potomac and demolish the rebel batteries about the Occoquan River. It was, doubtless, this Harper's Ferry incident which finally convinced the President that he could no longer leave McClellan entrusted with the sole and unrestricted exercise of military affairs. Yet that general had shown such decided ability in certain lines of his profession, and had plainly in so large a degree won the confidence of the Army of the Potomac itself, that he did not wish entirely to lose the benefit of his services. He still hoped that, once actively started in the field, he might yet develop valuable qualities of leadership. He had substantially decided to let him have his own way in his proposed campaign against Richmond by water, and orders to assemble the necessary vessels had been given before the Harper's Ferry failure was known. Early on the morning of March 8, the President made one more effort to convert McClellan to a direct movement against Manassas, but without success. On the contrary, the general convened 12 of his division commanders in a council, who voted 8-4 for the water route. This finally decided the question in the President's mind, but he carefully qualified the decision by 2 additional war orders of his own, written without consultation. President's General War Order No. 2 directed that the Army of the Potomac should be immediately organized into 4 Army corps, to be respectively commanded by McDowell, Sumner, Heintzelman, and Keyes, and a 5th under Banks. It is noteworthy that the first 3 of these had always earnestly advocated the Manassas movement. President's General War Order No. 3 directed, in substance, first, an immediate effort to capture the Potomac batteries. Second, that until that was accomplished, not more than 2 Army corps should be started on the Chesapeake campaign toward Richmond. Third, that any Chesapeake movement should begin in 10 days. And fourth, that no such movement should be ordered without leaving Washington entirely secure. Even while the President was completing the drafting and copying of these important orders, events were transpiring which once more put a new face upon the proposed campaign against Richmond. During the forenoon of the next day, March 9, a dispatch was received from Fortress Monroe reporting the appearance of the rebel ironclad Merrimac and the havoc she had wrought the previous afternoon. The Cumberland sunk, the Congress surrendered and burned, the Minnesota aground and about to be attacked. There was a quick gathering of officials at the Executive Mansion. Secretaries Stanton, Seward, Wells, Generals McClellan, Meigs, Totten, Commodore Smith, and Captain Dahlgren, and a scene of excitement ensued, unequaled by any other in the President's office during the war. Stanton walked up and down like a caged lion, and eager discussion animated cabinet and military officers. 2 other dispatches soon came. One from the captain of a vessel at Baltimore who had left Fortress Monroe on the evening of the 8th, and a copy of a telegram to the New York Tribune giving more details. President Lincoln was the coolest man in the whole gathering, carefully analyzing the language of the telegrams to give their somewhat confused statements intelligible coherence. Wild suggestions flew from speaker to speaker about the possible danger to be apprehended from the new marine terror, whether she might not be able to go to New York or Philadelphia and levy tribute, to Baltimore or Annapolis to destroy the transports gathered for McClellan's movement, or even to come up the Potomac and burn Washington. And all sorts of prudential measures and safeguards were proposed. In the afternoon, however, apprehension was greatly quieted. That very day, a cable was laid across the bay, giving direct telegraphic communication with Fortress Monroe, and Captain Fox, who happened to be on the spot, concisely reported at about 4 p.m. the dramatic sequel: the timely arrival of the Monitor, the interesting naval battle between the 2 ironclads, and that at noon the Merrimac had withdrawn from the conflict, and with her 3 small consorts steamed back into Elizabeth River. Scarcely had the excitement over the Monitor and Merrimac news begun to subside, when, on the same afternoon, a new surprise burst upon the military authorities in a report that the whole Confederate army had evacuated its stronghold at Manassas and the batteries on the Potomac, and had retired southward to a new line behind the Rappahannock. General McClellan hastened across the river and, finding the news to be correct, issued orders during the night for a general movement of the army next morning to the vacated rebel camps. The march was promptly accomplished, notwithstanding the bad roads, and the troops had the meager satisfaction of hoisting the Union flag over the deserted rebel earthworks. For 2 weeks the enemy had been preparing for this retreat, and, beginning their evacuation on the 7th, their whole retrograde movement was completed by March 11, by which date they were secure in their new line of defense, prepared for such an emergency, the south bank of the Rappahannock strengthened by field works and provided with a depot of food, writes General Johnston. No further comment is needed to show McClellan's utter incapacity or neglect, than that for full 2 months he had commanded an army of 190,000, present for duty,